October 7th is a special day for Vladimir Putin. He's a birthday boy. We can only imagine the revelry in the Kremlin as the cake is cut, then tasted by 3 people before Putin eats it to ensure it isn't poisoned. And Russia's leader would surely have hoped for a very special present as he turns 73 years old. Ukraine gave him the most explosive gift a Russian authoritarian could ask for. The country hit Putin with a brutal birthday surprise with its second straight day of mass long-range drone strikes. And Ukraine had something special planned for the birthday boy. Some of its drones penetrated a staggering 2,000 kilometers deep into Russia. The Kyiv Post reports that Ukraine's massive drone assault took place overnight on October 7th, with the headline target being the Russian city of Tyumen. Putin would have never expected that Ukraine could hit this city when he launched his Ukraine invasion. It's around 2,000 kilometers, or about 1,240 miles away from Ukraine's border. A few years ago, Ukraine didn't have a single weapon that could travel that far, never mind a weapon that could score a direct hit at that distance. But a lot has changed since Putin was in his late 60s. Ukraine now has several weapons that are capable of doing the job. Drones were the present of choice for Putin's birthday, and Ukraine used them to strike several targets throughout Russia. In Tyumen, the target was an oil refinery that the Moscow Times says is capable of processing around 9 million tons of crude oil per year. That crude is turned into usable oil-based products, including diesel and gasoline, that Russia needs for everything from fueling its military to raising money to keep Putin's war going. How successful Ukraine was with the Tyumen strike is up for debate. Russia wants the rest of the world to believe that Ukraine's drones didn't manage to hit the refinery in question. In a Telegram post, the Tyumen Oblast Government Information Center claimed that air defenses shot down everything that Ukraine sent into the city on Putin's birthday. 3 UAVs were detected and neutralized on the premises of a company in the Antipino micro-district of Tyumen, the post claims, before adding, "Reports of the UAV detection were received this evening. All emergency services responded to the scene. The prompt actions of the emergency services prevented the drones from detonating. There were no injuries. There were no explosions or fires. All businesses in the area are operating normally and have not stopped operations." So that's the end of that then, right? Ukraine tried to deliver an explosive birthday present to another of Russia's oil refineries, only for its drones to be shot out of the sky. There's even Telegram footage, shared by a local Telegram channel, that shows the emergency vehicles that the Tyumen Oblast Government Information Center says were sent out. However, there are a few things that don't add up here. For one, the Kyiv Post reports that several Tyumen residents claim that they heard a pair of explosions near the Tyumen refinery. These could have been explosions caused by Russia shooting down Ukraine's drones. However, if you were paying attention to the Tyumen Oblast Government Information Center's report on the situation, you may have picked up on this little tidbit. There were no explosions or fires. If there were no explosions, why are residents of Tyumen claiming that they heard 2 explosions? If Russia had shot down Ukraine's drones, you would assume it would be more than happy to claim that any explosions heard were simply the drones' payloads detonating under Russian anti-air fire. But the Tyumen government specifically said that there were no explosions, which contradicts what residents of the city are saying. More suspicions are aroused by the Kyiv Post adding that several Tyumen residents have reported temporary problems with their mobile and internet connections in the immediate aftermath of the Ukraine strike. This is a fairly common tactic for Russia whenever Ukraine sends drones into its territory. The Financial Times says that internet connections just so happen to cut out in drone-affected regions, which seems to be part of a Russian policy designed to prevent residents of those regions from sharing videos on social media. Russia's shutdowns are extensive enough to disable cash registers, prevent buses from validating transport cards, and of course, prevent access to social media platforms like Telegram. The number of mobile data outages hit more than 2,000 in July and August, more than triple the level in June, according to data from Nasvyazi, a Russian technical support project, reports the Financial Times. Russia claims that these shutdowns are necessary to aid the country's defense against Ukraine's drones. The real reason is that Russia doesn't want anybody inside Russia to communicate what is really happening when those drones reach their targets. Internet shutdowns in Tyumen in the wake of Ukraine sending drones 2,000 kilometers for Putin's birthday imply that something happened that Russia's authorities don't want the world to see. Could that something have been a direct hit on Tyumen's oil refinery? We can't say for sure, though there is one man who claims that the real version of events is different from the one that Russia is trying to present. That man is the head of Ukraine's counter-disinformation center, Andriy Kovalenko. He also took to Telegram in the wake of the Tyumen strike, and he had a very simple message to share. "Things have gotten bad for the Antipsk refinery in Tyumen," Kovalenko says. Its design capacity is 9 million tons of crude oil per year. Now, this isn't a direct confirmation that Ukraine's drones actually circumvented Tyumen's air defenses and hit their target. However, things getting bad for Tyumen's refinery at least suggests that Ukraine was far more successful in delivering its birthday present to Putin than Russia would have us believe. One final piece of potential evidence that Ukraine managed to score a hit on Tyumen's oil refinery comes from the Xelanova Plus Telegram channel. It shares an image simply labeled, "The consequences of the explosion in Tyumen at the refinery." The picture shows what appears to be a destroyed wall, though we can't see much damage beyond that. Perhaps Ukraine didn't do as much damage as it would have liked in Tyumen, but if Xelanova's photograph is accurate, at least one of its drones found its mark. We'll likely have to wait a little longer for more information about what really happened in Tyumen on the night of October 7th. What we do know is that the headline-grabbing 2,000-kilometer strike wasn't the only one that Ukraine attempted to mark Putin's birthday. The Moscow Times reports that Russia's defense ministry reported that Ukraine deployed over 200 drones on October 7th, with at least 30 of them heading toward the Nizhny Novgorod region that is east of Russia's capital of Moscow. That region's governor, Gleb Nikitin, says that the majority of these drones were shot down above an industrial zone in the town of Desertions. Nikitin claims that Ukraine failed to cause damage with these drones. Some debris landed on the premises of one enterprise, but no significant harm was caused to industrial infrastructure. The Moscow Times reports the regional governor as stating on Telegram. Ukraine, again, has a different story. While the October 7th attack on Dzержinsk may not have been successful, a separate strike conducted a day earlier was. On October 6th, Ukraine's general staff claimed that it managed to score a direct hit on the YM Sverdlov explosives factory in Dzержinsk, suggesting that the October 7th assault was a follow-up designed to wipe the remnants of the factory off the map. The facility was targeted because it's a major producer of high explosives including RDX and HMX, which Russia uses in several of its weapons. There's more. Ukraine's long-range drones also attacked the Voronezh region, which is in Russia's southeast. The Moscow Times reports that the region's governor, Alexander Gusev, issued the same sort of claims that Russia handled the incoming threat as his counterparts elsewhere in the country. Air defenses downed 17 of Ukraine's drones, Gusev claimed, though debris from some managed to damage the windows of a heating plant in Voronezh. But another contradiction arises. A little later on October 7th, Rosenergoatom, which is Russia's state-owned operator of nuclear power plants, took to Telegram to claim that Ukraine could have caused a lot more damage than it did. Ukraine's drones didn't target a heating plant. They almost hit a critical component of a nuclear facility. The Ukrainian Armed Forces combat drone attempted to attack a cooling tower at the Novovoronezh nuclear power plant, Rosenergoatom's post claims. It goes on to claim that incoming Ukrainian drones were suppressed using technical means before stating that, as a result, the UAV detonated after colliding with the cooling tower of the operating Unit 6 of the Novovoronezh nuclear power plant. We don't know how true this statement is. However, we know why Rosenergoatom wants to make it. The company alludes to Ukraine having supposedly targeted other nuclear power plants in Kursk and Smolensk in the past, suggesting that this statement may be a Russian propaganda play. It wants to paint Ukraine's drone strikes against Russia's military facilities as terrorist assaults. What better way to do that than to claim that Ukraine is trying to cause some sort of nuclear catastrophe with its drones? Gusev's earlier claim that Ukraine damaged a heating plant contradicts Rosenergoatom's statement. While nuclear power plants can generate heat, Gusev would have claimed an attempted attack on a nuclear plant if that's what really happened. It's almost like Russia decided that it wanted to change the narrative after the initial report to make it seem like Ukraine attempted to do something terrible. Regardless, it doesn't look like Ukraine's birthday drones in Voronezh managed to achieve much. The same can't be said for the drones that Ukraine sent to Belgorod. There, the Moscow Times reports around 1,000 residents were left without power following Ukraine's drone strikes, suggesting another attack on a Russian energy facility. The Belgorod regional governor, Vyacheslav Gladkov, added that an October 6th rocket attack by Ukraine also killed at least 2 people in Belgorod, one of whom was a worker attempting to restore power for the city's people. Again, how true all of this is could be called into question. The information comes from Russia, and we know that the Kremlin is trying to claim that Ukraine are terrorists. Still, Ukraine's birthday drone extravaganza for Putin clearly caused a lot of problems for Russia. In the end, Moscow claimed that it intercepted 184 Ukrainian projectiles between 11 p.m. on October 6th and 6 a.m. on October 7th. A second wave of 25 projectiles was supposedly also shot down between 7 a.m. and 8 a.m. on October 7th. The massive assault, as we've mentioned several times already, also amounted to the second consecutive night that Ukraine has sent a veritable horde of drones into Russia's territory. While Ukraine reserved its big birthday surprise for Tyumen, the night of October 6th saw it unleash at least 251 drones against Russia. France 24 reports that the Russian Defense Ministry claims to have shot all of these drones down, of course. But the October 6th strike was notable because it was the largest retaliatory attack that Ukraine has launched against Russia since the war began. Many of Ukraine's drones on October 6th targeted Crimea, with 40 supposedly being downed over the Crimean Peninsula, along with a further 61 being destroyed over the Black Sea. Others targeted Kursk, Belgorod, and even Moscow. All told, Ukraine's two-day drone attack saw it launch 460 drones at Russia. At least that's how many projectiles Russia's defense ministry claims to have shot down. It's very possible that Ukraine sent more and that some hit targets that Russia isn't reporting. And if we come back to Ukraine's extremely impressive 2,000-kilometer strike against Tyumen, there is also some evidence to suggest that the 3 drones Russia claims to have shot down may have actually hit their target of that city's oil refinery. Kovalenko certainly believes the refinery is in trouble. And even if it isn't, Ukraine's special birthday delivery to Putin reveals 2 things that will dampen whatever celebratory mood Russia's president might have had when he woke up on the morning of October 7th. The first of those 2 things is that Ukraine is still trying to hit Russia's oil refineries. Since the beginning of August, Ukraine has intensified its long-range drone strikes against Russia's oil and gas facilities to the point where it's had a massive impact on Russia's refining capacity. The Kyiv Post says that Ukraine's attacks have managed to take 38% of Russia's refining capacity offline by September 28th. That amounts to 338,000 tons of crude oil that should be refined but isn't every single day, with the knock-on effect being that Russia's gasoline output has fallen by 1 million tons. That's bad news for Russia's domestic gasoline market. It means Russia is about 20% short of fulfilling that market's collective demand. Shortages across Russia have been the result of these strikes, and Russia is starting to get desperate. On October 8th, the Kyiv Independent reported that Russia has expanded restrictions that were already in place on the sale of gasoline. Those restrictions now apply in the Sverdlovsk and, very interestingly, the Tyumen region. Connecting the dots here leads us to more potential evidence that Ukraine's attack on the Tyumen oil refinery was more successful than Russia claims. Why would Tyumen be under a restriction on gasoline sales if the refinery is working as expected? Either that refinery is still working and its gasoline is being sent elsewhere to cover shortages, or the refinery that serves Tyumen is offline due to Ukraine's drones. Either way, Tyumen is feeling the impact of Ukraine's drone strikes in more ways than one. The Kyiv Independent adds that these 2 regions are the 3rd and 4th in Russia that have imposed limitations on gasoline sales. Crimea and the Chelyabinsk Oblast were the first 2. In all cases, it seems that gasoline buyers are being restricted to 30 liters per customer, which is around 7.9 US gallons. That isn't enough to fill up the gas tanks in most cars, meaning these regional restrictions may also be preventing everyday Russians from traveling too far from home. For Ukraine, it's all about bringing the war back to Russia. These types of inconveniences, as minor as they may seem, play a huge role in achieving that objective. Russia's oil companies are also getting hurt by Ukraine's constant successful refinery strikes. On October 8th, Upstream Online reported that many of Russia's oil producers are now diverting their crude oil overseas rather than selling it to Russia's refineries. The reason is simple. Russia's refineries can't process the amount of crude oil they normally process because they're being taken offline by Ukraine's long-range attacks. The outlet adds that data analyst Kepler says that 9 of Russia's major refineries have had their operations hampered by Ukraine since August. In October, Ukraine's strikes are expected to take up to 500,000 barrels of Russian refining out of commission per day, which builds on the 380,000 barrels per day that are already offline. In other words, it's only going to get worse for Russia's refineries. Now, Russia's crude oil producers are jumping from the domestic ship and selling to overseas buyers because they can't sell at home. These crude oil sales don't generate as much money as refined oil sales. Plus, more crude oil leaving Russia means less crude oil for Russia to refine. Even if it manages to get its refineries back online, Russia may end up dealing with supply line issues as its crude manufacturers take their time switching back to domestic sales. Again, we still can't confirm that the 2,000-kilometer Tyumen strike actually took that region's refinery offline. But if it did, Ukraine just made a problem that Putin doesn't want to be dealing with even worse. Putin's 73rd birthday bash was made even worse by the sheer intensity of Ukraine's 2-day series of strikes all across Russia. 460 projectiles in 2 days are nothing to sniff at, and it sends a message to Putin that the already impressive number of long-range drones Ukraine has sent into Russia during 2025 is only going to get higher. The days leading up to Putin's birthday also saw Russia's leader get hit with several rounds of bad news, suggesting that Ukraine is only going to be hitting Russia harder from here on out. On October 2nd, Reuters reported that the US is going to start providing Ukraine with intelligence that will make it even easier for Ukraine to hit long-range energy targets inside Russia. The outlet adds that the US is also asking its NATO allies to do the same, meaning there will soon be an influx of information into Ukraine that could make its long-range strikes more precise as well as more intense. Volume plus intelligence means very bad things for Putin. The US move is believed to be the first major policy change that US President Donald Trump has approved since he began hardening his stance on Russia, and it also comes as the US considers whether to say yes to a request to provide Tomahawk cruise missiles to Ukraine. Those missiles have a maximum range of 2,500 kilometers, which is around 1,550 miles. Tyumen may find itself being hit by weapons that can cause far more damage than a handful of drones if the US approves this Tomahawk request and starts providing intelligence that helps Ukraine use them. On October 3rd, Forbes also reported that Ukraine has intensified its strikes against Russian trains, with a particular focus on those that are shipping oil to troops on the front lines. Beyond taking out refined oil at its source, Ukraine is also trying to hit gasoline and diesel supplies while they're in transit. Trains are a smart target for Ukraine to focus on, as Forbes explains. Despite their importance, Russian trains are inherently vulnerable to Ukrainian drone strikes, Forbes says. Trains in general are easy drone targets since they are large targets that follow linear routes along fixed tracks. Train routes and schedules can often be deduced through open-source intelligence. Who knows? If the US can add even more intelligence to what Ukraine gathers from open sources, we may soon be reporting on train strikes as much as we are reporting on Ukraine's refinery attacks. To add insult to this litany of injuries, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has also implied that Ukraine is now using its new long-range non-drone weapons against Russia. Speaking about several video clips that are doing the rounds on social media, Zelensky only had this to say: "From those fragments that are on social networks, you can see where drones were used and where non-drones were used. Are non-drones Ukraine's new missiles?" Ukraine's president wouldn't say much more than that, but as Ukraine's long-range assaults intensify, it seems that Putin can expect far more firepower to head Russia's way in the weeks and months that follow the big birthday surprise Ukraine delivered on October 7th. Sheer manpower is the greatest advantage that Russia can bring to bear against Ukraine. Russia has a threefold advantage in forces, the New Voice of Ukraine reported in September, and Vladimir Putin's plan is to bring that advantage to bear. It doesn't matter how many of his soldiers die in Ukraine. What matters to Putin is that he always has more waiting in the wings who can grind Ukraine's defenses down. However, numbers can be deceiving. And for Russia, many of these soldiers it sends to the Ukrainian battlefield don't end up sticking around for too long. Russia's army is bleeding troops as 70,000 of Putin's soldiers will go AWOL if the current trend continues. That news comes from United 24 Media, which reported on September 29th that an analysis by Russian media outlet Agentstvo Novosti has revealed that at least 70,000 of Russia's soldiers could abandon their units in 2025. That estimate comes from Agentstvo Novosti's analysis of data provided by Ukrainian open-source intelligence project Front Intelligence Insight, and it shows us that there has been a sharp increase in the number of Russian desertions since Putin launched his invasion. A chart shared by United 24 demonstrates what's happening. Russia has dealt with deserting troops since almost the beginning of the war, though the problem wasn't anywhere near as prevalent then as it is now. For instance, the data shows barely any desertions during 2022, though a slight uptick is seen toward the end of that year. From there, a consistent upward trend is apparent, with desertions rising to about 100 per month by January 2024. Then the chart skyrockets. By the end of the first quarter of 2025, Russia was dealing with upwards of 500 monthly desertions. That's a five-fold increase over the numbers seen in early 2024, and it tells us one thing: the Ukraine war is getting too brutal for the Russians who are fighting in it. More interesting details come from the Agentstvo Novosti Telegram channel, which also shares the chart and provides a comprehensive breakdown of the data. The channel explains how the data was collected, stating, "Front Intelligence Insight analysts reviewed tens of thousands of personal files from Russian military personnel collected by the Ukrainian project I Want to Live, as well as internal documents from several Russian units, the 2nd Motorized Rifle Division, the 30th Motorized Rifle Brigade, the 291st Motorized Rifle Regiment, the 144th Separate Motorized Rifle Brigade, the 1st Tank Army, and units of the 58th Army." I Want to Live is an interesting program. Created in September 2022, the program offers resources to Russian soldiers who are considering going AWOL and giving themselves up to Ukraine. Russian soldiers can contact handlers via phone, website, or messenger apps to arrange their surrender. West Point's Liebe Institute reported that several thousand Russian soldiers had already attempted to contact Ukraine via the service by January 2023. Not all of those soldiers managed to surrender, of course. Many will be killed long before they reach a handler. Still, these early figures showcase that there is interest in avoiding the fight among many of Russia's soldiers, and that interest seems only to have grown since the I Want to Live program was established. The Agentstvo Novosti report continues, by the summer of 2025, the monthly number of desertions and unauthorized absences from units was almost 6 times higher than in January 2024, according to one document containing a list of 13,800 such cases, with names and unit numbers for the period from 2022 to July 2025, the outlet says. Agentstvo Novosti also highlights the specific case of Russia's 30th Motorized Rifle Brigade, which is part of the 2nd Combined Arms Army. Documents covering 2,000 desertions dating between April 2023 and March 25 were uncovered. Those documents detailed a 6-fold increase in Russian soldiers going AWOL between the beginning of 2024 and the early stages of 2025. The numbers don't lie. These documents recorded 756 desertions from the 30th Motorized Rifle Brigade during the first 3 months of 2025. That's already more than half of the 1,189 recorded for all of 2024, and if that pace holds, it points to an annual total on the order of around 3,000 by year's end, a projection, not a confirmed outcome. Among other interesting pieces of analysis provided by the outlet is the areas from which Russia's soldiers are now deserting. While previously Russian soldiers most often deserted from military bases, by 2025 more and more service members were leaving directly from the front lines or failing to return from medical facilities, writes Front Intelligence Insight, according to Agentstvo Novosti. That tells us that Russia's soldiers are getting bolder. Perhaps they're starting to use the proximity to Ukraine's troops that being on the front lines presents to surrender. Others may simply be going missing in the chaos. Another interesting takeaway from the report is shared by United 24. It points out that the vast majority of those going AWOL are contract soldiers, at least in the 30th Motorized Rifle Brigade. Contract troops make up 73.6% of deserters, the outlet says, with around 22.1% of deserters being prisoners who have been given the choice between going to jail or fighting for Putin. This percentage spread might suggest that Putin's prisoner troops are more loyal than his contract soldiers. That may be the case. Back in September 2024, BBC News Russian reported that Russia's volunteer casualties outnumbered casualties among the convict soldiers. Prisoners accounted for 19% of the total deaths, the outlet discovered in an analysis, and there may be a good reason why. BBC Russian News notes that volunteer soldiers who previously worked in the civilian sector often only receive 10 days of training, and often as few as 3 days before they're sent to the front lines. Presumably, prisoners who fight for Putin receive the same level of training. However, their past experiences as criminals may mean that they're better suited to life on the front lines than the contract soldiers who barely understand how Russia's military works before they're sent to fight. That understanding may lead to fewer desertions. The prisoners may be gambling that they'll be able to use their wits to survive. After all, the alternative is to go back to prison if they're caught deserting, so taking their chances may seem like the better option. Alternatively, as the Moscow Times implied in an October 2024 report, fewer prisoners may be deserting because they die before they get the chance. Quantity over quality is the approach when it comes to Russia's convict ranks, with the outlet stating that Russia's convict soldiers are there to meet Russia's need to maintain a manpower advantage, rather than to achieve anything specific in Ukraine. However, this report contradicts the earlier one that suggests prisoner troops die at a lesser rate than volunteers. The one thing we know for certain is that Russia has a growing desertion problem. United 24 Media says that 70,000 soldiers going AWOL represents about a tenth of Russia's entire military presence in Ukraine. Medusa supports that assertion and even suggests that 70,000 may represent more than 10% of Russia's Ukraine war force. In April, it claimed that around 50,000 Russian soldiers had gone AWOL as of mid-December 2024. A figure amounts to 10% based on an estimate that Russia has around 500,000 soldiers in Ukraine, provided by Citizen Army Law leader Sergei Krivenko. This is a lot of soldiers to lose at the best of times, but losing those soldiers to desertion, Russia will be furious at that fact. But it also can't claim that signs of growing discontent don't exist in its military. In 2025 alone, Russia has seen 2 major incidents that showcase that many of its soldiers want out of Ukraine. Medusa reports on one of those incidents. It says that the night of April 18th to 19th saw 100 soldiers who Russia has already detained for desertion stage a riot at the Krasnodar garrison commandant's office. Those soldiers managed to break through a perimeter fence, most were captured. Those 7 managed to get away from the base. Of those 7, 4 were eventually recaptured, though 3 remained at large at the time of Medusa's report. The conditions of detention in which those soldiers were being held were cited as the reason for the riot. And it's in these conditions that we see why so many of Putin's troops are unhappy with the war. Beatings were common in Krasnodar. The detainees also did nothing while at the prison camp. They were kept behind a wire fence, shared outdoor toilet and shower facilities, and never left the area, even to work. This type of detention represents a certain kind of chaos, get-lost human rights advocate Ivan Chevaliev told Medusa in April. If before it was chaos where you could hide and run from the draft office, now it's a bloody chaos, designed to destroy people, Chevaliev says. This is no longer the kind of chaos that helps you avoid death. On the contrary, it's a raging meat grinder that grinds everyone up. But even more than that, what we see in detention centers like Krasnodar is a microcosm of the systemic issue of brutality that is often what leads to Russia's soldiers going AWOL in the first place. Deserters are held in horrible conditions, but Russia's active and compliant soldiers often experience plenty of this type of brutality before they make the decision to run. Russia's strategy of using meat assaults, in which it sends wave after wave of soldiers to attack Ukrainian defenses, is the perfect example. Those soldiers know they're being sent into these assaults to be used as cannon fodder. They're little more than numbers to Putin, as their lives exist solely so that Russia can identify Ukrainian firing positions using the bodies of its soldiers. It's this sort of approach that has led to Russia experiencing nearly 1.12 million casualties since Putin started his war. And it's a systemic brutality that offers more than enough motivation for any soldier who wants to take their chance on simply going missing. Other signs that Russian soldiers are desperate to avoid fighting come from the battlefield itself. Also, in April, United 24 media reported on an interesting incident. It said that partisans in the Kherson region of Ukraine had spotted Russian soldiers setting fire to their own military vehicles to avoid being sent to attack Ukraine's positions on the front lines. Artesh, which is the partisan group that provided the report, offered 2 reasons why Russia's soldiers would do something like this: devastating losses and severe orders imposed by their superior. In other words, the very type of brutality that we just discussed. If Russia is searching for a reason why 70,000 of its soldiers are likely to have gone AWOL by the end of 2025, these systemic issues of brutality are where it should start. After all, many of the rank and file in Russia's military are already laboring under the idea that their country doesn't care about the sacrifices they're making on Putin's behalf. Medusa revealed this in an October 8th report, where it profiled the cases of several people who Russia has sentenced to jail time for desertion. In many cases, those soldiers cite familial reasons for wanting to escape the Russian military. A family member may be dying, for instance, and the soldier isn't given leave to go back home and tend to them. That's at odds with how many Western militaries deal with the issue of illness or bereavement. According to the US Army Human Resource Command, soldiers are at least given leave to attend the funeral of a close family member. It's unclear whether Russia's soldiers on the Ukraine war's front lines receive even that, so there is often a tinge of desperation fueled by personal issues that lie behind many of Russia's desertion cases. If these kinds of examples hint at a lack of compassion within the Russian military, others showcase a complete disregard for the soldiers Putin is sending to fight and often die in Ukraine. The case of Sergei Gusakov is a prime example. A father from Russia's Stavropol Krai region, Gusakov appears to be one of Putin's convict soldiers, Medusa reports. He was sent to war in April 2024 after being sentenced to inflicting moderate bodily harm with a weapon 4 months earlier. By July, he had already deserted, and he remained on the run until his capture in November. When brought before the court, Gusakov used his final statement to explain that he chose to desert because of the need to preserve his life and health. He then explained the specific circumstances that led to his decision. Due to poor coordination among commanders, personnel were being sent on combat missions under the special military operation with almost no ammunition. This sums up Russia's approach to many of its soldiers in a nutshell. They are human garbage to Putin, Chevaliev tells Medusa. For defense ministry officials at any level, people are garbage, they're meat, nothing more, Chevaliev says. Why doesn't someone want to fight in a war? Because he doesn't want to kill or die, it's that simple. There's really nothing more to discuss. Or as the lawyer of one convicted deserter puts it when speaking about a client named Vladimir who received a prison sentence for his actions, better than ending up under a bush somewhere in Ukraine. Practically everything about serving in Russia's military, from the limited training that recruits receive through to how soldiers are treated on the battlefield, and even worse, when they're detained, feeds into Russia's desertion problem. Russian soldiers are going AWOL because the Russian military is set up in such a way that it brutalizes them throughout their tenures. So what is Russia doing to solve its desertion problem? It certainly isn't trying to make any sort of sweeping systemic changes that could lead to better conditions, less death, and a military in which its 70,000 deserters and counting might actually be willing to serve in. No, Russia is doing what it always does when it's faced with the problem of soldiers going AWOL. It heaps more brutality onto that which causes soldiers to go AWOL in the first place. In other words, punishments are only going to get harsher and more creative as Russia's desertion problem grows. Harsher prison sentences appears to be Russia's go-to when it deals with deserters. The country seems to be trying to strike a balance through which the length of a potential prison stay might be enough to convince its soldiers that running away isn't worth it. In 2024, Russian deserters could face a sentence of up to 15 years in prison for their crime. That may be set to change soon. In September, Medusa reported that the Kremlin has drafted amendments to its current desertion penalties that will see an extra 5 years tacked onto the already harsh 15-year potential prison stay that Russia's deserters face. Psychological intimidation is the goal here. This is Russia trying to communicate to its soldiers that there are worse fates than being on the Ukraine war's front lines. It's not better to be in prison than to be in a Ukrainian bush, the Kremlin is saying. At least not when that prison time could see you separated from your family for decades. At least in Ukraine, you may only have to serve for a year or two. You might even survive to see your family again. This sort of measure is somewhat conventional and, given how Russia treats its deserters, almost expected. However, not every deserter, or potential deserter, even makes it to court. On the Ukrainian battlefield, there are far more creative and often brutal punishments that await those who try to escape from their units. Russia doesn't mandate the types of punishments we're about to describe, at least not officially. But it also doesn't do anything to stop them, because a soldier who is forced to stay on the front lines or punished on the battlefield for failing to do so is a soldier who doesn't end up in court. It's better for that soldier to become a casualty than a walking example of why 70,000 of Russia's troops have gone AWOL. Reports of the Russian military's unique approaches to the desertion issue date back to 2023. That's when The Guardian reported that Russian commanders had started creating entire barriers of troops to prevent those who had been sent into assaults from retreating. Such retreats aren't technically desertions. In an intelligently run military, a retreat is often the best way to gain space and time to regroup after a failed assault. But for Russia, retreating may as well be desertion. A soldier who is sent to assault is there to win or die trying. One Russian soldier named Alexander Gorin explained what his commanders were doing in the aftermath of one of his unit's failed assaults. They placed barrier troops behind us and weren't letting us leave our position. They are threatening to destroy us one by one and as a unit. They want to execute us as witnesses of a completely negligent criminal leadership, Gorin said. We've mentioned systemic brutality in Russia's military several times. This is a perfect example. Why would any soldier want to stay when their own commanders are trying to force them to their deaths? Other forms of punishment are even more creative, though no less violent. In July, CNN reported on a video of a Russian service member being tied to a tree and left to his fate as a punishment for attempting to desert. That man is topless, and the video was apparently shot during the winter. If Ukraine's drones didn't get the deserter, the elements would have taken his life quickly. In September, the Kyiv Independent reported that a phone call intercepted by Ukraine's military intelligence proves that Russia has started actively maiming its soldiers to prevent them from deserting. "We caught a bastard near Mariupol," the soldier in the call says of a prospective deserter. "Soon you will receive a soldier with broken legs." That's bad enough. It sounds like the deserter has been beaten to within an inch of his life and is about to be sent to a military hospital. But then the second part of the call is shared. "Soon a fucked up soldier will be sent to you, lying around like bait for the Ukrainians." Being bait for Ukrainians suggests that the maimed soldier is being sent to a frontline unit to serve as cannon fodder. Again, it's about brutality. United 24 also highlighted a more novel technique Russia is now using to stop soldiers from going AWOL. On October 7th, it reported that at least one Russian commander has started seizing his soldiers' bank cards to prevent them from deserting. The idea is almost brilliant in its simplicity. A soldier will have a much harder time surviving going AWOL if they don't have access to money. No bank card means more risk, and that may just be enough to keep a soldier where Russia needs them to be. This is lawlessness, the Artesh partisan group that reported the incident said. Russia's soldiers shouldn't tolerate it, and the commander who did it knows that it's not right. He promised to return the bank cards after an upcoming transfer, as long as his subordinates didn't report his actions to higher-ups. But after everything you've heard to this point, it may be hard to believe that the commander would face any sort of punishment. If his card trick works and stops soldiers from going AWOL, that's likely fine with Putin. Russia's solution to the combined issues of its military's systemic brutality and the almost impossible conditions its troops face in Ukraine seem to be more brutality. 70,000 soldiers going AWOL should tell Russia it needs to come up with another solution. Whether it will, or whether it's even capable of doing so, remains to be seen.
Sometimes it's not the newest weapons that Ukraine needs to battle against Vladimir Putin's invading soldiers. As great as Patriot air defense systems and Storm Shadow missiles may be for Ukraine, the country also needs good old-fashioned firepower. Rockets, shells and howitzers can destroy Russian troop positions and equipment, no matter how old they are, and Ukraine is more than aware of that fact. That's why Ukraine will be delighted by what Greece just did. Greece has just delivered a vicious slap to Putin's face by sending Ukraine firepower that it can use to break Russia. On October 6, the Kyiv Post reported that Greece is going to be sending a host of weapons that Ukraine can use to conduct strikes against Russian forces on the front lines. This isn't a donation, the outlet says. Rather, Greece is going to be using the Czech Republic as a sort of intermediary, as it will sell the weapons to the Czechs, who will then pass them on to Ukraine. More details about the nature of the deal will come later in the video. But first, the most important topic. What will Ukraine be receiving from Greece? First up are 60 203mm caliber M110A2 self-propelled howitzers. These are far from the most modern howitzers in the world. Army recognition says that the original version of this artillery unit, named simply the M110, was introduced into the US military way back in 1963. A typical M110 frame is made out of sheer steel, the outlet says, and requires a pilot who operates inside an armored cockpit. That pilot is part of a crew of between 5 and 8 people, depending on the M110 variant, and the howitzer has proven effective enough that several countries have used it in the 60+ years that it's existed. Beyond the US, M110s have been purchased by many countries that include Germany, Iran, Israel, Pakistan, the UK, and of course Greece. This is, or at least was, a very popular howitzer. That's great for Ukraine, because it means there are still plenty of M110s lying around that could be donated to Ukraine, along with more than enough of the ammunition Ukraine needs to make the best possible use of this aging artillery system. The Kyiv Post says that Ukraine already has the perfect use for this sort of howitzer. The outlet describes the M110A1, which is an earlier variant of the M110, but is very similar to the M110A2s that Ukraine is about to receive, as a slow-firing howitzer that's capable of hitting targets at a range of more than 40 kilometers or around 24.8 miles. While this means that Ukraine could conceivably use the howitzer as an assault unit against Russian forces stationed in occupied territory, that likely isn't how Ukraine will use these weapons. Modern first-person view or FPV drones can serve that function over larger distances and with more precision, the Kyiv Post says. However, these older howitzers are ideal for offering Ukraine counter-battery fire. In other words, the M110 gives Ukraine artillery units that it can use to fight fire with fire. When Russia deploys its artillery as part of its assaults against Ukraine's defenders, M110s can fire on that artillery to take it out of the equation. The fact that M110s are mounted onto wheeled chassis is also a bonus. That means the howitzers can be moved to whatever position they need to be the most effective. Granted, that movement isn't always easy. The Kyiv Post notes that the M110A2 weighs over 28 tons, so driving it to a new location can be a fairly slow process. However, Ukraine can go from positioning to firing against Russia quickly. Once the howitzer is where it needs to be, a skilled crew can set up, fire, and then start moving to a new location in about 10 minutes. Of course, 60 howitzers won't be much use without ammunition. Greece has that covered too. It's going to provide 150,000 shells and firing charges along with the 60 howitzers, which gives each of Ukraine's M110A2s about 2,500 shells to work with. That isn't a huge number of shells in the context of the Ukraine war. In February, Forbes reported that Ukraine was firing about 5,155mm shells at Russia every day, creating an annual total of about 2 million shells. So, Greece has provided about a month's supply of shells for the howitzers it's selling to Ukraine. Plus, there's plenty of variety within these 150,000 shells, though more details on that will come later in the video. That's a starting point, and Ukraine should be able to use shells that it already has in its stockpiles to boost the longevity of the Greek howitzers. There isn't much more to say about the shells, So, onto the third part of the Greek package, Zuni rockets. Greece is going to be transferring thousands of these rockets in both their 2.75 and 5-inch varieties, the Kyiv Post reports. The exact number that thousands referred to isn't specified, but it should at least be enough to enable Ukraine to conduct more strikes with its aerial assets. Ukraine has already adapted many of its Soviet-era aircraft, including several of its fleet of Su-25s, to fire these rockets. The rockets will most likely be used by Ukraine to contain Russian forces in frontline sectors, the Kyiv Post says, while also noting that Ukrainian Air Force pilots have said that these rockets are both reliable and useful based on their usage up to this point. Additional information about the 5-inch version of the Zuni is available thanks to Odin. It says that the Zuni is a folding fin unguided aircraft rocket that was approved for production in 1957. The rockets have seen use in several conflicts, including the Korean War, and they can be very effective when used appropriately. The rockets have an operational range of about 8 kilometers, which is roughly equivalent to 4.97 miles, and they can hit speeds of up to 2,599 kilometers per hour. That's about twice the speed of sound, meaning the rockets fly with enough speed to make them tricky for Russian air defenses to handle. Zunis aren't impossible to shoot down, but no Russian unit is going to want to deal with them at a time when Russia has already lost 1,225 of its anti-aircraft warfare units since the beginning of Putin's invasion, per Ukraine's Ministry of Finance. Popular Mechanics adds that Ukraine has already used a pretty substantial number of Zunis to hurt Russia. All 6,000 of these rockets that the US has in its stockpiles were donated to Ukraine soon after Putin invaded. Ukraine managed to jerry-rig the LAU-10 launchers the rockets need onto its Su-25s, along with its Mi-24 helicopters, and had burned through this stockpile of 6,000 rockets by June 2024. That demonstrates one thing clearly. Ukraine finds these rockets very effective. Having thousands more at its disposal thanks to Greece can only be a good thing for Ukraine, especially in 2025 when its aerial power has been bolstered by the arrival of F-16s and Mirage 2000s. Now, back to something mentioned near the beginning of this video, the structure of the deal. And deal is the appropriate word because Greece isn't donating its howitzers, shells and rockets to Ukraine. Rather, it's selling them to a nation that's going to ensure that these Greek munitions get to Ukraine. It's here where the Czech Republic comes into play. According to the Kyiv Post, the idea for creating this deal was likely formed in September. That's when Greece's general staff decided to downgrade the howitzers it's now sending to Ukraine to the non-operationally necessary equipment status. In simpler terms, that phrase means that Greece doesn't need its M110A2s anymore. Once the howitzers were given that status, Greece freed itself up to ink a deal with anybody who might want to purchase the weapons, though it didn't seem to want to sell them directly to Ukraine. So Greece instead settled on selling to the Czech Republic, with both sides acknowledging that the weapons Greece was selling might then be transferred to Ukraine. There's an element of plausible deniability that's providing direct aid to Ukraine that Greece seems to want to maintain here. The reason that element exists will be explained later in the video. Under the terms of the new deal, Greece values its howitzers at around $36.4 million. Interestingly, the 60 howitzers are worth less than the shells that Greece has also agreed to sell. And it's here where the earlier mention of the variety that's seen in those shells become relevant. Among the shells that Greece is selling to the Czech Republic are 50,000 M106 high explosive shells. Those are valued at around $48.3 million, giving them a per unit price of $966. These are standard shells, at least in M110A2 terms, but they're not the only shells that Greece is going to sell to the Czech Republic. It's also going to sell about $38.4 million worth of ICM improved shells, the Kyiv Post reports. The Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessment says that these types of shells employ small bomblets that allow the user to blanket an area with small explosions rather than one large explosion. ICM improved shells are useful for dispersing troop formations and attacking elusive equipment, such as mobile artillery and air defense units, the outlet says. Greece is also going to sell 30,000 DPICM scatter mine shells to the Czech Republic for about $39 million. As the name implies, these types of shells scatter small mines around a target area, which makes them ideal for setting up ambushes or putting advancing troops in a position where they have to slow their assaults to navigate what amounts to an impromptu minefield set up around them. Exact numbers for the Zuni rockets aren't yet available, which means it's hard to specify what their sale adds to the price of the howitzers and shells. Militani estimates that the total value of the package is more than $231 million, which suggests that Greece is going to be selling $68.8 million worth of its air-to-ground rockets. Popular Mechanics says that a single Zuni cost around $400. If Militani's figures are accurate, that means the vague mention of thousands of Zuni rockets translates to 172,000 rockets. That seems steep. The odds are that it's substantially less than that. It's possible that Popular Mechanics' $400 figure is the old cost of producing Zunis, meaning it may not take inflation or the amount added to the cost of the rocket for overseas customers into account. Still, these are the estimates available so far. More information will become available once the Greek weapons arrive in Ukraine. There are also some caveats that need to be overcome before this deal goes through. The Kyiv Post says that Ukrainian media have already confirmed the details of the deal, but it doesn't mention whether or not Ukraine's military has confirmed that it will be receiving these weapons. Similarly, the sale is still in the pre-approval stage in Greece. The country's National Security Council has to approve the particulars of the sale, with its decision likely to come following a meeting that's been scheduled for some point during the next few weeks, the Kyiv Post reports. Greece also isn't going to do any maintenance on any of these old weapons before they're sold to the Czech Republic and eventually passed on to Ukraine. Everything is being sold as is, meaning some of the howitzers and munitions Ukraine is about to receive aren't operational. Still, Ukraine won't mind. Fixing old weapons is something that its military is very capable of doing, and it would likely find uses for the Greek shells even if the howitzers aren't in the best condition. Earlier in the video, it was mentioned that Greece is going through the circuitous route of selling to the Czech Republic rather than Ukraine itself for a reason. That reason becomes clear when looking into another piece of equipment that many in NATO want Greece to deliver to Ukraine: Mirage 2005 fighter jets. 25 of them to be exact, which NATO, the US and the European Union or EU have been pressuring Greece to donate to Ukraine since the beginning of October. The Defense Post published an October 6 report on this situation, noting that NATO believes that the transfer of these fighter jets would help to reinforce Ukraine's air defense stockpiles. The 25 Mirage 2000s could be transferred to Ukraine because Greece's maintenance contract for the jets, which it signed with France, runs out in 2027. Plus, Greece has already purchased 24 Rafales and is currently negotiating for 12 more, meaning its Mirage jets will soon be surplus to requirements. Indeed, the Greek Air Force is in the process of decommissioning these jets, according to the Kyiv Post. The proposed deal would be structured much like the one seen with the Czech Republic, the Defense Post says. An intermediary, such as France or Germany, would buy the jets from Greece and then transfer them to Ukraine. However, Greece is far less comfortable with this deal than it is with the one it's on the verge of doing with the Czech Republic for a simple reason. Greece doesn't want to provide advanced weapons to Ukraine. That's according to Euractiv, which points out that all Greek donations and sales to Ukraine so far have been of less advanced weapons. Greece has provided missiles, rifles and armoured vehicles to Ukraine, and it's even contributed to the training of Ukraine's F-16 pilots. But when it comes to delivering advanced weapons to Ukraine, such as the Mirage fighter jets, Greece balks because it's still very wary of angering Putin. The Greek media outlet Ekathemerini sums up the Greek mood when covering the pressure the country is under from its NATO and EU allies. It says that Greece going ahead with the deal for its Mirage 2000s is doubtful. However, Greece may end up being left with no other options if it wants to make any money from its old fighter jets. Discussions with India to sell them hit an impasse, and there were no takers from other Balkan countries either, Ekathemerini reports. Eventually, Greece is going to have to make a decision on these jets. Does it choose not to sell? In that case, Greece loses out on a chance to make some of its money back from its Mirages, but it also keeps itself off Russia's radar by remaining one of the EU nations that hasn't provided high-tech weapons to Ukraine, even indirectly. Or does Greece bite the bullet and sell the Mirages to a country that will provide them to Ukraine? That will anger Putin, sure. However, it may also come with the benefit of bringing Greece closer to its NATO and EU allies. For now, what happens with Greece's Mirage fighter jets is a question that will be answered another day. Coming back to now, Ukraine is on the verge of receiving howitzers, shells and rockets thanks to the deal between Greece and the Czech Republic, and all of these weapons will prove useful to Ukraine. For a start, Ukraine can always use more howitzers, even if the weapons it's receiving are several decades old. Peter Pomerantsev, writing for The Guardian in December 2024, made that point in an opinion piece where he claimed that it was time for Ukraine's European family to start providing more hardware and fewer cozy words to Ukraine. Pomerantsev makes the point that one of Russia's strategies is to use its own artillery to kill its way to victory in Ukraine. The Greek M110A2s have already been discussed as a means for Ukraine to counter this particular strategy, which is why more of any type of howitzer is always going to be better for Ukraine than none at all. Ukraine itself realizes how important the artillery battle is. In August, technology.org noted that Ukraine's growing defense sector has already gotten to the point where the country is producing more artillery systems than the rest of Europe every year. Chief among these domestically manufactured systems is the Tu-22 Bodana. As of October 7, Ukraine is at the point where it's manufacturing 40 of these howitzers monthly. The addition of Greece's old howitzers is essentially a solid addition to an ever-growing pile of artillery that Ukraine needs to cut down Russia's artillery advantage in the war. Ukraine is already well on its way to cutting down that advantage. In April, the Ukrainian army's commander-in-chief, Oleksandr Syrsky, said that Ukraine had cut Russia's artillery advantage in half, using long-range strikes that target Russia's artillery manufacturers and shell stockpiles. Where Russia once fired 40,000 shells daily at Ukraine, it was down to 23,000 per day by April. A great way to build on this good work would be to have more howitzers in Ukraine to counter those that Russia deploys. The Greek M110A2s fulfill that role, just like the artillery that Ukraine is making for itself. As for the Zuni rockets, they increase Ukraine's aerial power. Granted, these aren't high-tech missiles or even precision-guided bombs. However, as discussed earlier, Ukraine is very familiar with this type of rocket, and it's used them to do damage to Russia's forces many times in the past. One example comes from October 2024, which is when Militani reported that a Ukrainian Su-25 scored direct hits on a Russian building housing soldiers. The outlet notes that Ukraine's Air Force can use these types of rockets both to support Ukraine's ground forces and to shell Russian defensive positions. Zumis aren't accurate, Militani says, and they have a low probability of hitting a target directly. But they can serve almost as a form of aerial artillery, which means they could prove useful when Ukraine launches counter-offensives against Russian troops in occupied territory. Ukraine's missile industry has come a long way since the war began. The country recently unveiled a whole host of exciting explosive weaponry, like the extended-range Flamingo missile and the Sapsan, Ukraine's first ever homemade ballistic missile. Now, there's a fresh addition to the arsenal. A peculiar pot-bellied weapon that Russia has no chance of stopping, and it's headed straight for Moscow. The official name of this new missile hasn't been confirmed yet, but military analysts have quickly nicknamed it the Puffy Neptune due to its distinctive bulging appearance. As that nickname implies, this is yet another variant of the famous Ukrainian Neptune missile. The R-360 Neptune is a Ukrainian family of cruise missiles created by the Luch Design Bureau in Kyiv and officially entering service with the Ukrainian Navy in 2021, only a year before the Russian invasion began. The original Neptune was exclusively an anti-ship missile. Its design was based on the old Soviet Kh-35 anti-ship missile, with the Neptune offering better range and superior capabilities all around. It could strike ships over 170 miles away, while carrying a 330-pound warhead, dealing serious damage to any target in its sights. When the war began, Ukraine realized it desperately needed more missiles that could hit land-based targets, so its military engineers got to work, modifying the Neptune for land attacks. Development of this new land attack Neptune was fast-tracked, and it entered service in 2023. Soon after that, Ukraine began looking at additional ways to work on its Neptune missiles, with development teams starting work on the long Neptune variant in late 2023, hoping to extend the missile's range from 170 miles to over 600 miles. It took some time, but work on this new long-range variant eventually proved successful, and the first official reports of the Long Neptune in action emerged earlier this year, with Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky announcing that the project was complete in March 2025. The Long Neptune was also shown off in an Instagram video published earlier this year as part of Ukraine's Independence Day celebrations, showing just how much bigger and broader this new variant is compared to the original. Now, a glimpse has been revealed of a whole new type of Neptune missile, one that also looks very different from the original. The so-called Puffy Neptune was shown off to the Lithuanian delegation in Kyiv on October 7. The delegation also got a glimpse at some other pieces of Ukrainian military hardware, like the Peklo aerial drone, Magura V7 naval uncrewed boat, and more. But the new Neptune stands out as the most intriguing piece of equipment on display. While the Ukrainian Defense Ministry has not yet disclosed any precise details or technical specifications about this new Neptune, the photographs shared online by Defense Minister Denis Shmyhal have already been the subject of great debate among the military analyst community. Until there's official confirmation one way or another about this new Neptune missile, its capabilities can only be speculated upon. However, a few things appear almost certain. For one, this is most definitely a different Neptune variant than any seen before. That's evident by the fact that it has two prominent bulges on either side of the missile's midsection, just ahead of the main fins. These bulges are not present on the original R360 Neptune missile, nor can they be seen on any images or videos of the Long Neptune. An educated guess can also be made about the purpose of those bulges, and the main theory floating around military analysis circles right now is that the bulges are formed by a pair of conformal fuel tanks, or CFTs, fitted to the body of the missile. CFTs are often fitted to aircraft like fighter jets. They're specially designed to blend in with the aircraft's profile, providing the necessary fuel for it to travel greater distances without disrupting aerodynamics in any significant way. It seems as though that may be the case here, and the Puffy Neptune bulges certainly bring to mind the same sort of curvy protrusion seen on certain fighter jet models with CFTs, such as Eurofighter Typhoons and F-15EX Eagle IIs. Now, there are two main reasons Ukraine's forces would want to add additional fuel to the Neptune missile. The first, and arguably most likely reason, is for extended range. With two bonus fuel tanks fitted to its sides, this Puffy Neptune could theoretically travel much further than a standard R360. Of course, there's already a long-range version of the Neptune, the Long Neptune, capable of traveling more than 600 miles before striking its target. However, the Long Neptune is significantly larger than the standard model. It's said to measure up at close to 20 feet, which is several feet longer than the original, which is around 16.6 feet long. The Long Neptune is broader too, with some sections reaching a thickness of around 20 inches, while the original is 15 inches wide at its thickest point. Long Neptunes also have larger warheads than the originals, tipping the scales at 570 pounds, which is almost twice the size of the standard Neptune warhead. These differences mean that Long Neptunes inevitably cost more to make and may not be quite as easy to fire as the originals. They require either new or specially adapted launch platforms, which will cost time, money, and manpower to make. In the meantime, however, since Ukraine has been using the regular Neptunes for much longer, it already has the necessary infrastructure in place to launch them quickly and efficiently. This might explain the existence of the Puffy Neptune. It's not yet clear exactly how big this missile is, but some analysts have suggested that it's closer in size to a standard Neptune than a Long Neptune. If so, that means it could theoretically be fired from the same launchers that are used for regular Neptunes, but it could go significantly further than them, allowing Ukraine to strike long-distance targets and carry out more effective, explosive deep strikes on Russia without always needing to resort to its Long Neptune arsenal. This is exactly what one analyst, Oleg Katkov of Defense Express, theorized in a recent interview with Radio Envy's Pavlo Novikov. We now have three Neptunes: the standard R360 anti-ship missile, the Long Neptune with a 1,000-kilometer range, and the new chubby Neptune, which has noticeable bulges on the sides. The only logical explanation for these bulges is additional fuel tanks integrated into the body, they're not jettisoned, they're part of the missile structure, protruding beyond the standard diameter. The long Neptune is about 1.5 meters longer and has a larger diameter, 50 centimeters versus 38 centimeters for the standard Neptune. The chubby Neptune is similar in size to the standard Neptune, except for these extra side tanks. The purpose is clear: more fuel means greater range, or the same range but with a heavier warhead. As Katkov notes, the alternative explanation for the fuel tank bulges on the puffy or chubby Neptune is that it may be equipped with a larger warhead than the original. This would mean that the new Neptune may not travel any further than the original, putting its peak range around the 170-mile mark. However, with a larger warhead, this missile could deal much more devastating damage to whatever targets it hits. This too would be a big boon for Ukraine. With a more powerful variant of the Neptune in its arsenal, it could launch even more destructive attacks on Russian targets that are relatively close by, in occupied territories, for example, along the front lines, or even short distances beyond the border. Ukraine has already established an amazing track record of using its missiles and drones to launch one strike after another on Russian targets. Its intelligence services are doing a remarkable job at identifying the locations that matter the most to the Kremlin, like high-value oil refineries, production plants, pipelines, and storage facilities for fuel or ammunition, and taking them out one by one. However, much of the damage in these attacks is done by drones, and they're not truly capable of completely wiping out big pieces of infrastructure. A major missile strike, however, with new and improved puffy Neptunes, could be exactly what's needed to take these types of high-value Russian infrastructure off the map for good. So, if the extra fuel is purely there to counteract the additional weight of a larger warhead, it's still a great addition to Ukraine's missile arsenal. However, many analysts argue that the more likely scenario here is that the puffy Neptune has the same size warhead as a standard Neptune, and that the extra fuel tanks exist purely to extend its range, essentially giving Ukraine a kind of middle ground weapon between the original Neptune and the long Neptune. As Katkov puts it, if the standard R360 Neptune flies about 300 kilometers and the long Neptune 1000 kilometers, then the logical gap to fill is around 500 kilometers. So, my cautious assumption is that the chubby Neptune either flies roughly 500 kilometers or maintains the 300 kilometer range but carries a significantly heavier warhead than the baseline version. Defense Express appears to agree with this assessment, writing, "The thickening is with a high degree of probability conformal fuel tanks which allow to increase the missile's flight range. Recall that the R60 has a declared range of 280 kilometers, for the long Neptune 1000 kilometers. Therefore, taking into account the classic gradations of target ranges, it would be quite logical to assume that the puffy Neptune flies at 500 kilometers. 500 kilometers equates to around 310 miles. Certain parts of Ukraine, like the northeastern regions, are less than 300 miles from Moscow as the crow flies. That means that if the experts' assessments are accurate, Moscow could well be within range of this new puffy Neptune missile. The standard Neptune has never been able to reach that far, but the new variant could almost certainly could, and that could make it a game-changing force for Ukraine as the war rages on. Because even though the standard Neptune is an excellent missile and has proven itself on numerous occasions, it's been used to take out Russian frigates and other naval vessels, for example, as well as wiping Russian radars and air defense systems off the map. It's always been limited by range. It can only go so far, and Russia knows that. So Kremlin commanders have smartly repositioned important assets like high-value radars and so on deeper into their own territory. They've also ensured that new infrastructure, like military production plants, is built further back in Russia's inner regions, making these locations impossible to strike with standard Neptunes alone. And even when Ukraine received other missiles from its allies in NATO and across Europe, many of them too also had the same limited range. Storm Shadow missiles, for example, supplied by the UK and France, can only fly around 155 miles to reach their targets, while America's ATACMS can hit targets around 190 miles away. Plus, allied nations have historically imposed rules and restrictions about how Ukraine can use their weapons, and for a long time, Kyiv didn't have permission to deploy NATO weapons on Russian soil. Thus, the country has always been restricted in some way when it comes to missiles, and that's a big reason why Ukraine has worked so hard, dedicating so much time and effort to improve its domestic missile programs and capabilities, unveiling exciting additions like the puffy Neptune, the long Neptune and others to break through those barriers and overcome the obstacles that have stood in its way for too long. Now, with new missiles in the ranks, there's no telling how much damage Ukraine could do. So many locations that the Russians thought were safe are now within range, not just of long Neptunes, but likely of the puffy Neptune too. And with two similar but distinctly different threats to worry about, the Kremlin will have no way of knowing when, where, and how Ukraine might strike next. The best part of all of this is that despite only just seeing some of the first official images of this new puffy Neptune, it's already said to be ready to roll out onto the battlefield and used in strikes against Russia. When unveiling the missile, Ukraine's defense minister, Denis Shmyhal, stated that the foreign guest saw ready-made solutions that strike the enemy at the front and in the rear. Our manufacturers presented their own products, which can be produced in partner countries tomorrow within the framework of the Build with Ukraine program. Drones, ammunition, missiles, robots, artillery and armored vehicles are what we're producing now and what we're ready to produce together with partners. We call on partner states to invest in building the arsenal of the free world. Build together with Ukraine. Ukraine's weapons are the weapons of the free world. In other words, this new missile, along with the other weapons and military hardware shown off in Kyiv, is ready to launch and could even be produced in allied nations without any notable delay. This suggests that Ukraine has the capacity to make a good number of puffy Neptunes, strengthening its missile stocks massively and possibly paving the way towards even more frequent and impactful deep strikes against Russian targets in the weeks and months to come. Already, reports indicate the enormous impact of these kinds of attacks. Right now, for example, there's a gigantic fuel crisis going on in numerous Russian regions, and its effects are spreading fast, far and wide across the vast nation. In western, central, and even far eastern regions, along with occupied territories like Crimea, gas stations are having to either shut down entirely or impose strict limitations, controlling how much fuel the average customer is allowed to buy. Some of them are setting specific quantity limits, others are blocking purchases unless customers have loyalty cards. Many are utterly unable to provide the usual range of fuel options or sufficient quantities to meet the high levels of demand, and Russian motorists are lining up for hours on end just to buy even a half tank full of gas. Prices are also skyrocketing right now, and in some areas, as well as on the black market, Russians may have to pay up to half the national median salary just to refuel their cars. This is due to several factors, like Western sanctions imposed on Russia and the fact that many nations across Europe and beyond have stopped buying Russian oil. But by far the biggest contributing factor to the ongoing crisis is the fact that Ukraine has repeatedly used its drones and missiles to seek out and strike at Russian oil refineries and other fuel industry infrastructure. Time and time again, Ukraine has struck hard at places like pipelines, oil tanks, and fuel storage facilities, and Russia may not have felt the impact of those attacks right away, but it's definitely feeling it now. In fact, some expert estimates suggest that the country has lost up to 38% of its oil refining capacity, which works out to around 338,000 tons of oil every single day. Gasoline output has dropped by a staggering 1 million tons too, and about 70% of these outages and production cuts are directly linked to Ukraine's attacks. And if Ukraine can do all of that with just relatively cheap and simple drones carrying quite small warheads, just imagine how much more havoc it could cause for the Kremlin with high-powered missiles like the puffy Neptune. Even if it's carrying the standard Neptune warhead, which weighs in at around 330 pounds, that would be enough to reduce entire buildings to piles of rubble or trigger gigantic explosions and fires after a direct hit on an oil refinery or similar location. What's more, Ukraine could easily combine puffy Neptune attacks with drone strikes, using the drones as cover, just like Russia regularly does with its own attacks on Kyiv and other cities, then following up with the missiles to deal the knockout blow. Of course, there's still much to learn about this new Neptune variant, and official confirmation from Ukraine's military or defense ministry is needed about exactly what it is and what it's capable of. Its true size needs to be established to see how it measures up to the existing Neptune models, for example, as well as its maximum range and the size of its warhead. Confirmation is also needed about the true purpose of those potbelly style bulges on the body, though it's almost guaranteed that they're concealing additional fuel tanks. Once more information is available, it'll be possible to make accurate assessments of this missile's potential and predictions about how it might be used moving forward. But one thing is certain, this new Neptune is one of several powerful additions to Ukraine's missile stocks, alongside the likes of the Sapsan, Long Neptune and the Flamingo, all of which boast their own exciting benefits too. The Sapsan, for example, can travel at 4 times the speed of sound, or around 3,100 miles per hour. The long Neptune hits targets hundreds of miles away with flawless precision. The Flamingo is reported to be able to go even further, with the ability to strike almost every major military base and high-value piece of Kremlin infrastructure all over Russia. With all these new missiles, Ukraine is getting stronger, right as Russia grows weaker. The Kremlin is losing troops at record rates and watching its economy go up in flames as its oil refineries burn and the fuel crisis deepens. The tide of war is well and truly turning, and Ukraine is in the ascendancy. The only question left is, when and where will the puffy Neptune strike first if it hasn't been used already? Now, learn more about the dire situation in which the Kremlin finds itself in our recent video, looking at how September was a veritable month of hell for Vladimir Putin and his Kremlin underlings. Or check out this video detailing how Russia is so desperate it's even having to resort to sending soldiers into battle on horseback. And finally, make sure to subscribe to our channel too, so you can stay in the know about everything that's going on along the front lines of Ukraine and beyond.